It's a really huge pleasure to be here tonight. I think this might be the most beautiful bookstore I've ever been in, and I have been in many, many bookstores, particularly over the last month or so. I'm Rinku Sen. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Applied Research Center. We are a home and hub for all of the people in the country who care about race and racial justice, and our job is to popularize the idea of racial justice and help prepare people to fight for it. We do that largely by telling the stories of ordinary people and the structures and rules that have shaped their lives. And so this book, The Accidental American, stands as the most current example of a project we've done and that I personally have been really invested in working on to illuminate for people by telling the story of an actual person, an actual human being, using that story to illuminate for people how our immigration policy works. What I'm going to do is read from two small sections of the book, one from the very beginning and one from near the end, and then I'll talk a little bit about what all of the stories in the book add up to. What does it all mean in terms of a framework for immigration? And then my co-author, Fekkak Mamdouh, who's also here, will follow me and will talk a little bit about his reflection on those same questions and on that same period of time. So the first part I'm going to read for you starts right on page 1. It's from the introduction, and the introduction is called Coming to Citizenship in a Near Global Age. And I think it's fairly self-explanatory, so I'll just move right in. At 8 a.m. on September 11th, 40-year-old Fekkak Mamdouh was asleep, having worked the previous night's late shift from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. His wife, Fatima, lay beside him. She had dropped off their daughter at kindergarten 4 blocks away and then climbed back into bed. For 6 years, Mamdouh, whom everyone knew by his surname, had been a waiter at Windows on the World, the luxury restaurant on the 107th floor of the World Trade Center's North Tower. He had started working there in 1996 when Windows reopened after the '93 terrorist bombing in the building's basement. Mamdouh's wide brown eyes and the round apples of his cheeks gave him a disarming look of innocence. These mellow features hid the scrappiness that had made him a beloved, though sometimes controversial, union leader. The first call came from Mamdouh's sister Saida, who lived in Italy. She told him to turn on the TV. The second call was from his brother Hassan, who lived down the street. "Listen, brother, there was a plane that just crashed through the Twin Towers," Hassan said. "Guess what? You're not going to have a job for a couple of months while they fix the place." Mamdouh and Fatima turned on the TV thinking of terrible accidents when the third call came, their neighbor telling Fatima to get their girl out of school. Fatima hurried to retrieve her daughter Iman. When she got back, Mamdouh was still transfixed by what was flashing across the television screen. He said, "You watch. They're going to say it's Muslims." Fatima asked him why he thought so. "Because they did it in '93, he said, referring to the earlier attack. Without eating, Mamdouh left their house in Astoria, Queens. He went to 8th Avenue and 44th Street, the offices of his union, Local 100 of the hotel employees and restaurant employees. He and other union members made 2 lists, one of all the workers who would have been catering breakfast for risk management employees that morning, and another of all the places where they might be found. Then teams of shop stewards and union organizers set off to search for the workers and track their families. Mamdouh paired up with a colleague, an Egyptian immigrant and now former captain at Windows. The two started out at hospitals asking who had been brought in. They met many families of people who had worked at the World Trade Center, but they found no actual casualties of the attacks. They made their way down Manhattan's West Side, where all its hospitals are located. After the 4th one, Mamdouh's companion, who had been crying steadily, said he couldn't take any more. He went home, while Mamdouh headed to the morgue on 1st Avenue and 30th Street, staying there until 3 a.m. The following night, Mamdouh gave an interview to a cable news channel. One of his friends, another Moroccan, saw the interview and called him the next day to ask why he hadn't said that Muslims, meaning regular, real Muslims like them, hadn't done this thing. Mamdouh told him that people already knew. For the next 5 days, Mamdouh ate and slept very little. He spent hour after hour circling the morgue's lobby carrying a sign. If you know anyone who worked at Windows, or if you worked at Windows, please call the union. Mamdouh was able to cross barback Mario Peña's name off the missing list on September 12th, and he found cashier Fahima Nasser a full week later. But in the end, 73 of his co-workers weren't coming back. A couple of days after the attack, Mamdouh and Fatima went to their neighborhood Pathmark store. She had covered her head in hijab, as she had since her mother died 3 years before. It was evening, and the store was not at all crowded. They were the only people wanting to buy fish, and Mamdouh stood at the counter with her while she tried for several minutes to get the fishmonger's attention. Eventually, Mamdouh's patience gave out. "Hey, she's trying to talk to you," he said to the clerk, who continued to ignore them. "She's trying to ask you a question." "Don't you know what you guys did?" was the response. "What?" "The World Trade Center." It was a mumble, but Mamdouh heard it clearly enough. He snapped. His eyes widened, his smallish frame puffed up. "What are you talking about, what we did? I lost 73 of my friends there. Maybe you didn't lose anybody and you don't know what you're talking about." The clerk backed up from the counter while Mamdouh yelled, "I want to see the manager." He yelled some more at the manager, who apologized, but neither Mamdouh nor Fatima would ever return to that store. Something shifted in Mamdouh that day. The clerk's accusation had wounded him. 2 days after the tragedy, he was ever aware that he himself could easily have died. He suffered for the loss of his colleagues, and the idea that someone would associate him with their deaths because he was Muslim was shocking. Until then, he had been living the life of a lucky immigrant, getting great jobs in high-end restaurants because he spoke fluent French. He had come to the United States to make money and to be near his younger brother, and although he missed Morocco, he had felt American enough to marry here and have 2 children born as U.S. citizens. Despite his prediction to Fatima that Muslims would be blamed for 9/11, he had actually managed to get by for 12 years without noticing American discrimination in a daily way, not toward Black people or Asians, and certainly not toward himself. Now he rewound his history, noticing things that he hadn't clearly seen before. He couldn't yet know, however, that these new insights would reshape his life as an immigrant worker in America. So that is the first section I'm going to read you. And the next section is a little bit shorter, and I'm going to skip way ahead to chapter 8 in the book. And what has happened in the interim is that Mamdouh has ended his career time as a waiter and become an organizer, a community organizer of restaurant workers, largely immigrant restaurant workers, but eventually in the 6 or 7 years between September 11th and now, reaching out to all restaurant workers. And he'll say more about the organization and its many victories later, but the important thing for you to know before I read this next part is that their most recent campaign of the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York involved 250 workers from 7 different restaurants, all owned by the same person. And it was started not by back-of-the-house immigrant workers, dishwashers and runners and prep cooks and so on, but rather by a white woman, a young white woman who was a waitress in quite a high-end restaurant right in Midtown Manhattan, whose tips were being stolen by her managers. So this woman, Jennifer Massia, was about 24 years old at the time. She had already been working in restaurants 7 years since she was in her teens, and she had called the organization to say, the managers are stealing our tips or taking our tips every night. A portion of them, is that legal? Is there anything we can do about that? The organization said, it's not legal. We can help you win back your stolen tips and wages, but we want you to reach out to the immigrant workers at the back of the house, because if you're having problems, they definitely are too. And eventually that did happen, and all of the workers together, front of the house, back of the house, immigrant and native born, won this enormous campaign in New York City. And this is Jennifer Massia's reflection after the campaign is over about the process of building something together. For native-born workers in the restaurants, the Fireman campaign was the first time they had organized around conditions in the industry. Massia was the most likely person to make the connection between the front-of-the-house workers and the back of the house, but the structure of the restaurant industry prevented her from seeing it. She knew her family had a tough immigration history. She'd grown up with racially tolerant parents, and she had friends among the back-of-the-house workers.